You helped me to get out of Australia. I helped a few people last year, but it just... Am I going? I'm going to say I'm mic'd here, so I may stop talking. Perfect. Great. Well, look, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning still. Absolutely delighted to join you here today to celebrate International Women's Day. And I'm going to start by saying Happy International Women's Day and wishing everyone a Happy International Women's Day. I don't mind saying this. I mean, a lot has changed in the last year. This time last year, I was in my spare bedroom upstairs, surrounded by boxes in a rented house, talking into a laptop, moderating this event. So absolutely delighted to be here in person, to be engaging with people, but also that we have people able to join in online. And I think that's really the direction that we're going now in any workplace where we can have this blended type of event and blended type of engagement. So while a lot has changed in the last year, I think it's fair to say in the last 100 plus years when it comes to women's rights, we've seen massive improvements. It's a long time since 1908 where you had 15,000 women march in New York, demanding less working hours, demanding better pay and demanding voting rights. And I don't think anyone who took part in that march at the time, they were marching specifically for their own lives and the impact that the restrictions were having on them. But over 100 years later, almost 120 years later, the impact that still has, the fact that every year we now celebrate that event, we celebrate International Women's Day, we celebrate their achievements, but we celebrate the achievements of so many other wonderful women who have gone before us, who have paved the way, who have enabled us to do what we do now in our roles. But it's also an opportunity to maybe highlight the progress that still needs to be made. And obviously, we're well aware that there are still issues that we need to overcome to ensure that we have full equality, whether it's in the workplace or whether it's across society. So delighted to have our three speakers. A change where we don't have the two Oonaghs, we have one Oonagh and two Maeves. So delighted to have them join us, and we'll return to them in a few moments. But a really important element of that march that took place so many years ago was the call for pay equality, or better pay, but pay equality now. And we've been doing a piece of work in the department on a gender pay gap report. And we're going to hear now from Gertrude and Alice just exactly what's in that report. I think the gap itself is not only a significant issue in terms of policy concern, but the implications that it has economically and societally for women is absolutely massive in the workplace in comparison to men. And the sad fact is that there are still women doing the exact same work as men and getting paid less, and that simply shouldn't be the case. So we need to play our role and our part in trying to improve that and rectify that within the Department of Justice. Analysis like this report, I think, highlights the potential for disparities and inequalities, but what we hope really is that the results of the report will allow the department to undertake strategic workforce planning and to support the development of each and every one of you here and all of the employees within the Department of Justice. And it's a really important step towards gender pay parity, and really pleased that we have both Gertrude and Alice to present that work to us here today. Maybe before I ask them to come up, just from my own point of view, I have to say the Department of Justice, not only being a fantastic place to work over the past 2 years, it has such a vital role in improving the lives for so many women, the length and breadth of this country, but also beyond. And maybe just to touch on two particular issues at the moment, it's very hard to speak in any format without mentioning what is happening in Ukraine, an illegal war that is a fundamental breach of international law. The troops on the ground show a blatant disregard for a sovereign state, but above all, these actions show a blatant disregard for human life. And while the men are staying to fight and defend their country, and many women also, the millions of people that we've seen so far and that will continue to flee into neighbouring countries and our own country are mainly women and children. And so there is a clear obligation on us as a department working across government to make sure that we provide every support that we can, that we welcome them to our country, and that we put in place the mechanisms and the resources to help them through what is such a difficult time. And the Department of Justice won't be found wanting in that regard. And just thanks to everybody in the department who has been working at what is a very changing dynamic and environment, and to thank you for the work that you will do, because obviously this is not going to go away anytime soon. Secondly, an issue which I have prioritised, but I know so many in this department are really passionate about, and that is tackling domestic, sexual and gender-based violence. I've said it many times and I'll keep saying it. I think this is an issue that we look on in years to come and ask ourselves how we allowed it to be treated as a lesser crime for so long, or how we allowed it to happen for so long. And while huge strides have been made, in particular through the Department of Justice, through the ratification of the Istanbul Convention, through the criminalisation of domestic violence, introduction of coercive control, the 2 strategies that we've passed already, I believe that our 3rd national strategy can and will be the most ambitious strategy, changing our structures, how we respond to, how we deal with domestic and sexual and gender-based violence, not just within the Department of Justice and across government, but as a society. So no pressure on us, as we're obviously the department that will now be leading on policy, the implementation of the strategy, but also now service delivery. But I am absolutely confident with the people in this department that we can achieve that goal. And it's a pretty ambitious goal, 0 tolerance for any kind of violence or abuse against women and girls. But as I've said, I absolutely believe that we're up to the challenge. Finally, I'm just going to leave you this one point before I ask Alison Gertchen to come up. This year's theme for International Women's Day is breaking the bias. And while it is absolutely the case as individuals, we are all responsible for our own thoughts and our own actions all day, every day. Really, International Women's Day is about bringing people together and working collectively. So we all have a role to play, but if we're really going to break that bias, we need to make sure that we work collectively in our everyday lives, in the work that we do, and obviously as a community as well. So I would encourage you to look at it that way, and obviously to play your part, as well as obviously the individual roles that you have. So I'll leave it at that. I'll ask Gertchen and Alice to give us a presentation on this, and then we'll move on to our Q&A with our panellists here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. So myself and Gertchen will just take you through an overview of the methodology and the findings from the Gender Pay Gap report. I suppose just as to kind of context set, the results from this analysis will be used partly to inform the rollout of the upcoming equality, diversity and inclusion strategy. They'll be used for strategic workforce planning, and they also provide a good baseline upon which we can measure ourselves and our performance into the future. So at a kind of an overall level, the gender pay gap is a metric that's used to tell us the difference between male and female earnings, and it's one way of identifying inequalities in the labour force. And these inequalities are driven by a myriad of different social and economic factors. But really the focus of this report was an analysis of the salaries of males and females in the Department of Justice and its agencies. So I suppose just to kind of talk you through the methodology that we took for this, anonymised data was received from the NSSO through HR, and this gave us the salaries of all the staff in the department and its agencies. There was also additional information on the data in terms of the number of dependents, the number of children, whether people had taken statutory leave in addition to annual leave. So this data was also used to help us with our analysis. The analysis itself was conducted by the Irish Government Economic and Evaluation Service staff who sit within the research team, Declan Costello and Sean Kiley, so thanks very much to them for all their work on this report. In terms of the gender pay gap metric, there are two kind of overall approaches that you take to the analysis, so the unadjusted and the adjusted gender pay gap. So essentially the unadjusted gender pay gap is a straightforward analysis of the average salary of the male versus the average salary of the female. So minusing the female from the male, dividing by the male's salary to give us that percentage difference between the two. So it's a very straightforward approach and it gives us the actual gap in the salary. But where we lack the detail is what's driving that difference and whether certain characteristics such as whether people have dependents or not. So you're comparing, say, males with children versus females with children, what difference does that make? And we don't get that within the unadjusted gender pay gap metric. But the benefit of that simplicity of that approach is that it does enable us to compare where the department sits versus other departments and other sectors. And Gertchen will go into that in a little bit more detail. We can share kind of where the department sits versus others. So the other approach is the adjusted gender pay gap, and that takes into account different characteristics. So as I mentioned there, whether people have dependents or children, and I suppose just for clarity, dependents can include a spouse or others who are dependent on the individual, so it's not just children. So we conducted both, and you'll see in the detailed report that will be available, there is analysis on the unadjusted and the adjusted. In terms of the adjusted, we were able to include information on the full-time status of the employee, so whether they were full-time or part-time, the number of dependents they had, the number of children that they had, and the length of time they'd been in the civil service and the length of time that they'd been at their current grade. And all of those factors, when we ran them into the kind of a regression model, they enabled us to understand the impact that that has on the gap. And again, all of that detail is provided in the report, but you can see that certain characteristics, the gap is larger, and Gertrude will take you through those results in a little bit more detail. I suppose overall, just to say, before we conducted the actual analysis of the gap, we also looked at the general profile of the department and its agency staff. And that provides a good context in terms of the analysis. So we saw that 60% of the department and agency staff are female versus 40% male. I suppose, unsurprisingly, females are more likely to have taken statutory leave in addition to their annual leave. They're more likely to be part-time. I think 78% of our part-time staff are female. And they're more likely to have been in the department and in the civil service for longer as well. So that's, I suppose, just some context before we actually share the results. So overall, we conducted, as I said, adjusted and the adjusted gender pay gap analysis. So the unadjusted gender pay gap for the department is 9%, and for agencies is 8% in 2020. For 2018, 2019 and 2020, you can see there hasn't been a huge shift in the pay gap. So it was 10% in 2018, 9% now in 2020, sorry, for the 2020 analysis. So we certainly need to be looking at a lot longer period of time to see if there's any trend and any changes. And that's certainly something that we hope to do over time. So we've got details there of the salaries as well. So the average salary for the females was nearly 43,000 versus 47,000 for males. And for agency staff, it's 52,000 for females versus over 56,500 for males. So that's the data that we were using to compare the two and to give us that. I think I've gone off there, but I'll talk loudly. 9% for the department and 8% for agencies. So in terms of that adjusted gender pay gap, so just to confirm, that's where we control for certain factors, where we can see the differences. So full-time status, dependents, children, length of time in the service. The gap reduces to 4% for both department and agencies. So we can see that even when controlling for those factors, there's still what they kind of call this unexplained gap of 4%. I suppose there's a number of factors to consider as part of that. We were only able to control for factors that we had data on. So something like education status, or kind of the education that people have received, we didn't have. So there was other elements that, I suppose future analysis we might be able to explore to see if that gap can be explained any further. But there is also part of that gap that could be to do with choices that women have made or haven't want to make that may impact on that gap. And that's certainly something that can be explored in more detail, possibly more qualitatively as well as quantitatively. So I'm going to hand you over to Gertrude now, who'll take you through a little bit more detail of how that varies by certain characteristics.
So what we're going to do for brevity is we're not going to go through all of their like-for-like comparisons. We're only going to look at a handful of them. But it's just to kind of give you an indication of some of the differences. So one of the first ones is to actually look at the grade comparisons. Now, this kind of graph, on the one hand, is a wee bit busy, but I still quite like it. Hopefully I'm not going to throw the camera off if I move. So one of the things you'll see is the columns here represent the salaries. But this red line is the interesting line. This is a percentage gender pay gap. So if you look at the grades, one of the things that you see is that there are some variations by grades across the department and agencies. So for example, one of the interesting things for the department is that the gender pay gap is actually comparatively low for the PO grade and the CO grade, EO and AO grades. And actually for the EO and AO grades, it's actually in favour of women. There's, for a better phrase, a negative gender pay gap at those grades. For agencies, it's interesting as well. At agencies, at the AP grade, above there's degree of equivalence, and in fact, it goes in favour of women as you kind of increase in terms of the grade. Now, for the CO and AO picture, it's very varied. You'll see it's quite choppy. That red line is quite choppy. And the reason it's actually quite choppy is because for both the department and for agencies, there's a significant variation for those people who are on the higher bands. So when you reach, let's say, the CO higher band or the EO higher grade, the variation, the gender pay gap actually increases significantly. So if you look at that agency chart there, every spike that you see is actually on the higher grade. So that's actually kind of an interesting kind of variation that we've seen in the data. Another area that we kind of looked at was the impact of caring and caring responsibilities. So as Alice noted, one of the things that we looked at was individuals who had caring responsibilities. To care here can include a partner, a spouse, parent, children, or some other relative. From the data, one of the things that we saw was that within that overall, around 52% of women had caring responsibilities versus 34% of men. And while we saw that there was a wee bit of choppiness in the data when we're looking at grades, here it's actually quite more clearer. If you look at that red kind of line, which is the percentage gender pay gap, as people take responsibility of caring for dependents, the difference increases, and indeed the difference increases substantially the more dependents that one has a responsibility for. So care or caring for others clearly is kind of driving aspects of the gender pay gap. We also did it by age as well. And in age, it's interesting as well. There's some kind of variations, but the general line of direction of travel is that as you increase in age, the gender pay gap tends to increase. Now, again, there are some variations there. So if you look at the department, those at the younger age groups, say the 25 to 29 to 30 to 34, actually the gender pay gap is actually in favour of women. Similarly, in the agencies, you'll see that those between 30 to 34, and it's an interesting variation between those who are 40 to 44, the difference there. You see that in some age cohorts, the gender pay gap is actually in favour of women. But the general direction of travel is saying, as you become older, the gender pay gap increases. Now, there were some other kind of variations there that we picked up. For example, whether you're working full-time or part-time, how long you have been in the department. But for the sake of brevity, they're in the report and you can actually kind of pick them up. But the interesting thing, as we said, was the unadjusted gender pay gap is 9%. Now, how do we compare? If we look at Ireland in total, the gender pay gap is around the 14% mark. So the department is actually doing better than Ireland as a whole. However, we did see, once we get to look at those adjusted figures, we see that there are some variations there, and so those variations I think are important for us to actually explore to further drive down the gender pay gap. So we had a look at those like-to-like. So factors such as care for dependents and age, those are the ones which are worthwhile further exploring about what's actually driving the differences between men and women. There would have been some analysis that we would have loved to have done, but we couldn't have, simply because the data wasn't there. So, for example, educational attainment. The data snap that we got from the NSSO didn't capture that. Ethnicity and nationality, a few years ago we were saying, Ireland's becoming a more diverse society. Well, I think Ireland is now a more diverse society. So it would be interesting to actually kind of understand how ethnicity or nationality actually impact in terms of the gender pay gap. We will run the gender pay gap report again. The question is the depth of detail that we go into it. But clearly, those are areas that we would be particularly interested in kind of picking up, and we're looking at some options to actually bring that data into it. So the report is there. It contains a wealth of detail, and I think it's there to actually not only benchmark where we are now, but also in terms of the unadjusted data. Adjusted data, I beg your pardon, to give us areas to focus on in order to consider where to go next. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Alison and Gertjan. We'll have a Q&A later if there are any questions, but I think most importantly, obviously, this will be available to colleagues across the department, and most importantly, there'll be another one at some stage where people can contribute again if they haven't this time round. What's so important, and I suppose for me, even in the last 8 years in my role in politics, but more recently in departments, if you're going to bring about change or drive change or make any new policy changes, you need to be armed with as much detail as possible. So the detail in here obviously has given us some indication why the gap exists in the various different scenarios, and obviously the more information we can get, the greater change we can bring about. But thank you very much for your work on this, and obviously look forward to this being examined further and hopefully having a really positive impact on people working within the department and obviously right across the justice sector. So we're going to move over to our panellists of speakers. I think we're very fortunate in the Department of Justice that we have so many wonderful women working across the various different sections, very ably led by our Secretary General, Oonagh McPhillips, who I should have welcomed and mentioned at the outset, but Oonagh needs no introduction either, I think. So instead of me introducing maybe Oonagh and our two Maeves, I might ask them to introduce themselves. Apologies, Maeve Brett and Maeve O'Higgins, I should give them their proper names. I'm going to ask them to maybe introduce themselves because it would be really interesting, I think, just to hear from you how you got where you are now. I suppose the your educational background maybe, but also the work that you've done and the roles that you're currently in now. So I'll maybe start with Oonagh and ask her to say a few words.
Thanks very much, Minister. I was going to say to the two Maeves, now you know what it feels like. But anyway, so my name is Oonagh Buckley. I'm the Deputy Secretary of the Department with responsibility for civil justice. And just for the information of those watching, that includes immigration matters, it includes civil law and reform, and it includes the courts and the other agencies on the civil side. I've been in the department a little over 3 years. It feels like quite a bit longer at this stage because it's been one damn thing after another, frankly, since I arrived. Between geopolitical events and everything else, and at the moment, obviously, we're trying to reorientate to meet the crisis brought about by the terrible events in Ukraine, and our hearts go out to all the people who are having to flee effectively for sanctuary in Ireland at the moment, and we're trying to manage that incoming wave. As to how I got here, I did the best thing one can do as a civil servant, which is that I keep on changing jobs approximately every 7 or 8 years or so. And I encourage every civil servant to do this and to do something completely different. So I started in foreign affairs. In the last major land war in Europe had just finished, the Bosnian crisis, and I was on the former Yugoslavia desk, which really does date me. I then moved on to work in the Custom House in what was then the Department of the Environment, now the Department of Housing, and I worked on planning law and various matters for 10 years nearly, and was promoted from AP to PO in the one section. They kept on saying, Oonagh, you have one more bill in you. And I did about 8 or 9 pieces of primary legislation. I then moved on to the National Parks and Wildlife Service, where I became a director and I protected things like the Kerry slug, and that was great crack. And I spent a lot of time in Brussels trying to explain ourselves to the Commission. I then went to the Department of Finance, where we were plunged into the thick of the challenges brought about by the recession. And I was moved, initially I was working on HR policy, but then moved into pay policy and dealt with all the difficulties and the pay deals and the industrial relations deals that came with that. From there, I jumped into the Workplace Relations Commission, where I was the CEO there for a couple of years, very enjoyable time. And a lot of what we're talking about today, obviously we saw the hard end of that because we saw the cases where people weren't treated fairly in their environment, and we saw the cases where that still arises. And then finally, the job came up in the Department of Justice, and I thought it looked absolutely unmissable, and it was unmissable. So I have no regrets, despite 3 years of turmoil. So there you go. Maeve.
Thanks, Oonagh. My name is Maeve O'Higgins. I'm the Health and Safety Manager for the Department of Justice, and I'm responsible for the occupational health and safety function within the department. I'm a health and safety professional. I have over 20 years experience, 15 in the private sector and 5 glorious years in the Department of Justice, which I know was my first foray into the civil service and the public sector in general. I've worked across a variety of industries in the past, from large civil engineering, construction projects to providing health and safety advice to the pharmaceutical industry, and also within the kind of wider corporate environments. I joined Justice, as I said, in late 2016 to, what was, I wouldn't say a greenfield, but a brownfield site, certainly for health and safety. So it was I suppose a challenge at the start to kind of, conduct, a gap analysis, because, Justice is one of these departments that there's such a variety of work going on. I mean, we have a lot of people who work in offices, but then we have a lot of people who work in labs. We have a lot of people who work in, front-facing roles that are dealing with, quite traumatic and quite vulnerable people. So it is probably, hand on heart, the most diverse organisation I've ever worked in. So my role sits in the central corporate pillar, and I provide health and safety advice to both the criminal and civil pillars and agencies. Probably the busiest 2 years I've ever had in my life, just behind me. I'm hoping they're behind me. We'll be talking about resilience later. But I have to say, in a glutton for punishment type of way, it was also probably the most fulfilling.
Thanks, Maeve. So my name is Maeve Brett, and I've just realised that I'm the newbie to the department. I'm only in a few years. So I started my career, well, more or less in the probation service in 2001. So at that time, slightly later, the recession hit, so the embargo hit. So I was there for quite a lot longer than I'd hoped initially, even though they were very good to me. I was there for 18 years in total. So I worked up through being a probation officer right up to being what ended up being a regional manager. So then in 2019, I went for principal officer, and I got jettisoned into head of the BMU with no experience. I had to Google what the BMU was when I got it. So that was interesting. And then 8 months into that, the pandemic hit. And as I say, the rest is history. I never realised how close I'd get to Oonagh Buckley or Maeve O'Higgins until January 2020. That worked out okay. So that was there for the duration of the pandemic. And I have recently moved since last year to being principal officer with responsibility on the other side of the house now, the criminal justice side. So I lead up the strategic policy planning and research team there. So it's really only since mid-19 that I've gotten to know all my colleagues in the department. And yeah, it's been busy, it's been hectic, it's been weekends, but it's been great. And I hate to tell you, Maeve O'Higgins, that was the training ground for the future. It wasn't just the pandemic. But it's been good. It's been good.
Brilliant. Well, look, I think that the first take to take from those comments is that we have Oonagh for another 3/4 years. And I, for one thing, will make sure that while I'm here, that we get as much out of you as possible. If I could maybe just ask a broad question. Obviously, today the theme is breaking the bias, and whether it's in the department itself, whether it's in justice and our agencies, or in general in society, I suppose coming together to try and break that bias and to make progress is the key theme. And just in your own work, in your own lives, in your own experiences, where do you see progress being made, or how has it been made? Where do you see further progress that needs to be made in breaking down bias, not just in your own work, but also in society in general? So it's quite a broad question, but maybe just to start with that, if I could ask Oonagh.
Thanks, Minister. What has changed in my time in the civil service, which is the guts 25 years, is that there are far more visible leaders who, the leadership is much more gender balanced than it used to be. Even used to be 10, 12 years ago. I recall when I went to the Department of Finance, I was summoned over to the Minister's office, and the then Minister, Mary Harney, was waiting to meet us, and I arrived in and she went, "A female principal officer in the Department of Finance, where did you come from?" And I said, "Another department." But you can tell that was it. So the other thing I would say is that there are far fewer examples, particularly in the civil and public service, where it is just simply not acceptable from a leadership perspective to show gender bias visibly. So there are very few instances where you see very visible problems of the organisations coping with the different genders. I have to say, with probably one notable exception, Minister, which you showed yourself in the last year, where an organisation has struggled to cope with somebody becoming pregnant in the role. But anyway, that's to be resolved. But what you do see is ongoing, more structural, subtler problems, so that they're structural in the sense that we accept a level, and we accept it as a society, and we also accept it within our workplaces as a level of structured gendered employment. So that is that people tend to graduate towards certain types of roles, and if you see somebody of the opposite gender doing that role, there's a hesitation about it. What's that about? And that's a very difficult thing to shift, because that's a very structured thing in society. And I think that there are certain still subtle biases around the types of roles that people are expected to be able to take on. And that is linked very much to, well, that's a 24/7 job. Somebody needs to be available all the time. The political system will need them to be there. So that person with small children to mind, or with an aged parent to mind, or whatever, just won't be able to do it. So let's take our eye off her, because it's generally her, and move and look to somebody who we think will have the time and space to devote themselves 18 hours a day or whatever it is to that really difficult job. And that becomes more intense an issue as you move up through the system, and as you get closer to the demands that the current political and media process play on public servants. So one of the things that was very noticeable, and it's people like Oonagh McPhillips and so forth that are breaking the mould a bit, was that it used to be the case, if you looked at the Secretary-General level female civil servants in the civil service, many of them were in non-political facing roles. And it was unusual to see women in the political facing Secretary-General roles. That is changing, which is great, but it's a real challenge in that space. And I know that there are other jobs as well where we just, maybe in our mind's eye, there's a little bit of a blindness that says that's always been a job for a guy, so we just need to, we look away from the people that are eminently suited to do it. But hopefully we're changing our mindset around that, and we're looking at the brain and the intellect and the skill set and the ambition, rather than the body that is cloaked in.
And I think that's obvious as well from the presentation that you gave, unfortunately, where you can see that steady decline or gap extending as people take on responsibilities, either with children or other caring roles. So really something that we need to address. Obviously, Maeve, you've been in both the private and public sector as well, so it'd be good to get your view from both angles and sides.
Yeah, well, in my own profession, I suppose, particularly back in the when I started out in 2001, 2002, it would have been in the height of the construction boom. And at the time, I would have done a lot of work on civil engineering and construction sites, and there were days when I was the only woman on site. There was no toilets for me on site. I had to get into my car and drive to a garage and drive back. I was a novelty, you know, and what did I know about, you know, heavy plant and underground cables, and they soon learned. But, you know, I mean, a testament, I suppose, to my perseverance, because I had grown up in a household where, I suppose, probably more my mother would have been that there was no such thing as a boy's job or a girl's job. You know, I was sent out to get the bucket of coal and my brother was made wash up, you know, and stuff like that. So growing up with that, so that had given me the confidence, you know, that I never thought that anything was beyond me. But like they were difficult. I mean, the jokes and the banter and all that, you know, was difficult. But I've seen now, particularly in my networks, the amount of women, the amount of young women that are choosing, you know, health and safety and the wider construction and STEM subjects as their profession. It's, you know, a lot has happened in that 20 years in this country, and that's, you know, I think we need to call that out as well.
I suppose that only happens by having people in roles and becoming leaders as well. So well done in doing that. Maeve, just from your own point of view, the challenges that you've faced, but I suppose what you've overcome as well.
Yeah, I think mine was a bit more clear-cut, because starting off as a young social worker back in 1997, I don't think there was any male social workers on my team at all. It was a woman's job, and that was it, you know. And to contrast that then, the BMU was a real eye-opener, because the women were front and centre, and there was no job that the women wouldn't do that the men could do. It was really, really interesting. They were there, they were in the cold face, they were hands-on. So when I compare those two different experiences, I think we've made huge inroads. It's really, really heartening.
Maybe just, I might put a specific question to each of you in the current roles that you're in at the moment, but I'll stick with the format we have, and in particular asking Oonagh. I mean, you've mentioned some of the really significant issues that you've dealt with, the Bosnian War, the demise of the Kerry slug, the financial crisis, as well as now the illegal invasion of Ukraine. And I suppose you can only assume that you build up a huge amount of experience, but a way in which to deal with and to respond to these type of crises. So it's, you know, we're talking about in particular the pandemic and the last 2 years, and just how did you apply the way in which you dealt with those issues to your work in the last 2 years in particular?
Thanks, Minister. Yeah, just to reassure anybody from the Commission who may be watching, the Kerry slug is still alive and well. The real problem is that it's gone over the border into Cork. But anyway, that's another problem. The problems that we face as a country, and I think the last few years have really shown it, and this current crisis that is now upon us shows it even more strongly, is that we can only tackle issues when we adopt a more whole-of-government approach, and when we collaborate together and try and break out of our own particular, not niche, but our own particular areas of primary concern, and say, what is it that we can do to solve, not only help solve our own problem, but help solve the problems that other departments are having to lead on. So a great example from COVID was the Department of Health was leading on so many huge tasks. How did other departments had to come in and assist them and help them, both by being there to take some of the slack, by handing over staff, by also taking things off their table and saying, okay, we'll do this bit. Now, I'm sure the Department of Health would probably say we still ended up doing a huge amount, and they did a huge amount, but there were bits and pieces that it was possible for us to take as a collaborative approach where we were working together. And it's very easy, and I confess it happens to me, probably has happened to me multiple times even in the last 2 weeks, where you approach something from a very justice set of sort of norms, and you have to step back from those set of norms and say this is now a situation which is very different from the one that we can react in the normal way, and we have to do so in a way that is both at a higher level, a more whole of Ireland, and less focused our own particular needs. The other thing is that, and I'll leave Maeve speak to this because she was remarkable, but I think one of the things that you find when you end up in this space is you end up dealing with groups of people that you never expect to deal with. And Maeve can talk about being on SOGs or senior officials groups, which are a peculiar form of torture, perhaps, for imposed by the Department of Taoiseach. But it's to how you can manage to make sure that the department's position is presented well, delivered well, preserved, advanced, but at the same time you're working in a collaborative way. I don't know whether, Maeve, you want to just, I mean, that was, I know you were quite challenged by that when it first started, but do you want to?
Yeah, but I think we actually grew to like the torture eventually, because it became a daily torture, even at the weekends. I suppose there is that element of imposter syndrome, really, is there, 8 months into a new job, trying to step up to the PO role, being a woman, and suddenly you find yourself on these senior official groups. You're still learning the role, and you're so mindful of not to let yourself down, and obviously not to let the department down as well. But I think anybody who tells you that they didn't have imposter syndrome is probably not telling you the truth, if we're all being really honest. And I guess,
how did you deal with that?
I guess for me, Minister, it's how you framed it. So I actually framed it as an opportunity, and I was very fortunate, and it's not often I'll give Oonagh Buckley and Oonagh McPhillips open public praise, but in fairness, there was support there. I think Oonagh was probably on most of those SOGs with me, but she was very kind to let me take the lead when I could. So what turned into something that was quite intimidating, it actually kind of manifested in a different way. It became an opportunity. And I suppose there was 2 key learnings for me in that. The first was, well, obviously prepare. that doesn't even need to be said. If you go into a SOG unprepared, you're looking for trouble. But it was just to build the relationships, which was absolutely key. And some of those relationships, I'm still working with those people now, in different forums. And it really does stand to you to just stretch yourself. But also how quickly, and this may be a female thing, I think it's a male thing as well, but how quickly you can adapt to those situations. So we moved from a situation where the SOG was, oh God, to a situation where it was, oh, what time is it at? And that, I suppose that's huge developmentally as well. So it's just interesting how you can, I suppose, reframe a situation that's could be one of terror into one of accomplishment, which was good, yeah.
And I'm just wondering, in your role as head of border management unit, I mean, obviously you had to adjust in responding to the SOG and being prepared, but obviously the huge adjustment was at the airports and in dealing directly with people and the changing laws and the legislation and the policies, which unfortunately changed on quite a regular basis, and we were asking people on the ground to respond. I mean, what were the biggest challenges that you think you faced, and how did you respond to them, particularly when you were managing a team of people? I assume Google gave you so much, but obviously you had to do so much yourself as well.
No, absolutely. I suppose there was 2 aspects to that, Minister. I suppose the first one was the human side. There's a very large team out there in the BMU. There'd be nearly 180 at that stage. And the BMU, no more than any of the other frontline services within Justice and externally, and we won't have to name them, they didn't go home. So they were there in the pandemic where COVID was coming through the airport on an ongoing basis. So I suppose the first part for me was getting that human, the workforce part right, because if we didn't get that bit right, we wouldn't get the second bit, the operational bit right. So I suppose it was realising that every one of those 180 people have their own story, they had their own fears, they had their own families, they had vulnerable people. And it was really just to support and motivate those people to continue to be able to come into work. And it was really great because we actually got to a point of where people were concerned about having to come in. And then as the pandemic went on, you could see people getting very proud of what they'd done. And there was this real sense of accomplishment. And that was fantastic. The second huge challenge, obviously, once that first part was going fairly okay, we had a few audits, but what we got through them was obviously the business side. And that was all about the operation. And we'd all come out in a sweat if we start thinking about it again. But, there was huge things. There was the scaling down, first of all. There was the contingency planning. I don't want to say it in a Buckley, but there was the mandatory quarantine introduction, which was very stressful.
We had to volunteer to help, I'm sorry.
And then, of course, the most stressful unusually was the opening up. We had huge sleepless nights about how we were going to get people through the airport with all of these checks. And as you know, Minister, that went up to government. It was a huge piece of work that was coordinated, in fairness, from SecGen all the way down. And I guess I was lucky in a way because I have the social work background, probably looked after the staffing side, and the business background probably helped with the operational side. So it was luckily for me, it was a good fit, but it was nothing more than luck.
Well, I have to commend the work that was done, and I think it was probably one of the most unusual visits I've had to the airport, where I was, along with the border management team, the only people in the airport last year. But, you know, as you say, to be able to keep the spirits up and for people to come into work and then to ramp up as quickly as they did was really a testament to you and to all of the team. And now, obviously, Conor, who's taken over as well. You mentioned just the fact that you're dealing with people who are worried in a pandemic, people who are concerned, not just for their own health, but for their family and the potential for people to become seriously ill. And obviously, Maeve O'Higgins, your own role, that is your bread and butter, essentially keeping people safe. But this is in a heightened environment, dealing with a global pandemic. And I'm sure there must have been a weight in terms of being responsible for people within the department, but across the wider justice sector. And maybe just to hear from you how you dealt with that, or, you know, the type of actions that you had to take, how you dealt with it yourself.
Thanks, Minister. Yeah, there certainly was a weight of responsibility, because not only, you know, did I have, I suppose, the responsibility for the border management unit, but there was also the wider frontline services. Maeve alluded to there, like we had quite a significant number of people who, you know, stayed on site, continued to deliver services. So the weight of responsibility, and I see the pandemic in kind of two stages. So we had the stage, we'd say, leading up to lockdown, and then the stage after that. And because it was a novel virus and there wasn't that much known about it, particularly at that first piece there, where those decisions, we were delivering our services, and those decisions had to be made. There was a lot of external noise. There was a lot of unknowns. And I suppose in terms of that kind of decision making, I was able to draw on a lot of my experience, a lot of the tacit knowledge that I would have built up over the years, working in high-risk environments, kind of high-consequence environments. So almost like trusting the process of decision-making in terms of risk management. But yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, there were days where it was, you know, it was very difficult, because I suppose I felt, you know, at the time there were people dying. You know, there were people dying. There was a sense of things becoming out of control. And every person that puts on a uniform or, you know, turns up to work is a human being with a story and a family. And the responsibility that they were having to come into the workplace and then go home to that family. Yeah, it certainly is not a time that I would like to revisit. But, you know, again, with that kind of confidence in, you know, my training and, you know, my own scientific background, I was able to put that kind of process to my decision making. And, you know, I suppose in hindsight, us scientists don't like to talk about luck, but, you know, there's certainly, you know, I think there was a lot of other people other than me that contributed to those safe environments as well.
And can I ask, maybe just following on from that, and I'll apply this to all three of you. I mean, you have roles and had roles over the last 2 years during the pandemic where you were responsible for a lot of people, and obviously I suppose the consequences for those people, but you have to look after number one as well, or you're not going to be able to do your job. So how did you, I suppose, mind yourself, cultivate a positive mindset, switch off? I found myself, while I wasn't in the office a lot, I was waking up on my phone, I was going to bed on my phone, I was taking calls all day, every day. And to get that work-life balance, you need to be able to do that. So really interested just to hear how you managed to do that, particularly in the intense environments that you were working in. I'll throw it out, whoever wants to.
Oh, sure, may as well. I'm on a roll. Yeah. I could be funny and say I didn't. You know, there were weeks where it was just constant. There was no switching off. And I suppose that, you know, like I do take that weight of responsibility very seriously. So, and I suppose for me it was difficult as well, because whilst I live in Dublin, all my family is down in Cork. And for me, kind of seeing my family is quite a big, you know, it's one of the ways that I would, you know, was relax and whatever. And so I didn't have that. And also didn't have any of the normal social outlets that one would have. So I spent, whatever free time I had kind of in the garden, just enjoying the good weather that we had and, where possible. And just, I suppose, trying to just find some part of the day where there was just a bit of peace and quiet and just to reflect. And I think that kind of personal reflection as well is all part of, how we build resilience to keep going and to move on. Probably was a few gin and tonics involved as well, if I'm honest.
I'd say if everyone was honest, they'd give the same answer.
I suppose from my point of view, it was very, very tricky in the airport because there really was very few days when something wouldn't be going on out there. So it was actually quite tricky to actually try to switch off. And the phone was a constant. I mean, the phone was literally last thing at night, first thing in the morning, and sometimes maybe even before you would normally be awake. For me, I suppose two things I always rely on. One is, thankfully, I have a good sense of humour. So even in the darkest days in the BMU, there would always be at some level, some reason to have a smile somewhere along the way. The second thing is that we were blessed in the BMU that we have a very, very good team on the front line, but we have a very, very good management team. So going into work or having to work the longer hours wasn't actually in any way disconcerting. It was actually enjoyable at one level in terms of who you were dealing with, and I obviously applied that to all the colleagues in the department as well. But in terms of those downtimes, I would always try on a Sunday to have some level of downtime, if at all possible. Now, unfortunately, the health with the regs had particular timings for those, somewhere at midnight on a Friday night. So it didn't always work that way. But I guess it was a little bit unusual. It's a pandemic. We're hopefully never going to see it again. And I think we all survived, so we did something right anyway, whatever that was.
Brilliant. And Oonagh?
Yeah, I'm an institutionalised senior civil servant, so I'm used to having my phone attached to my hand 24/7, basically. But the one thing I suppose I've learned over the years is you can control certain things, and one of the things you can control is that at certain times you need to take time out to cook, for example. And as you can probably tell, I quite like cooking. In fact, I quite like eating. And so I would always try and cook one meal a day. I try to use my 2 km effectively to take some class of a walk if I could at all. And in fact, that's been a technique I've used for years to try and get out, even if it's first thing in the morning, to get some fresh air. And because that may be the only chance you get that day to get out, and actually getting a piece of fresh air is good. And I was given a great piece of advice as a very young AO, and I had an absolutely miserable day involving a parliamentary question. It's burnt into my memory. I won't tell you it now, but it was a brutal day. And I felt like quitting. And a very senior HEO turned around to me and said, "Don't worry, go home, have a big glass of wine, go to bed. Tomorrow is another day." And he was dead right. I rocked into work bright as berry the following morning, and it's been like that ever since. So that's what you have to do, no matter what sort of rotten day you have in the office, no matter how bad a day you have at the office, no matter who you have a fight with or whatever. And I always apologise if you have a fight with somebody. But I learned that too. Is that tomorrow genuinely is another day, and whatever bad luck you have the previous day, if you come in with a kind of okay, let's see what we can do now, I think it tends to work things through. I also have to say that probably WhatsApp was really useful at times. Maeve, Brett will know what I mean, but some very active WhatsApp group entitled BMU at times. But anyway, particularly when we were in SOGs.
I think we have a bit of a common theme emerging. Maybe you'll have to tell us what your tipple is maybe at the end of it. But I also took up gardening, and needless to say, that hasn't continued or lasted, but was great while the sun was shining. I think it's really important, I suppose, for people to talk about the challenges that they faced and how you dealt with it, because I think it just helps other people as well, and going, God, I'm not alone, or God, I felt that difficult. So it's really important that we do have these conversations. We want to leave time for questions, but I'm going to ask one question of you. This is maybe directed at our men here, and I'm delighted that we have men here, but how do you feel men can empower and support women, be it in the workplace or otherwise? Again, it'd be a broad question, but I think the only way we reach our state of equality is by men and women working together. So I think it would be good to get your views.
I think for me, sharing the load. I don't have children, but my husband is very, very supportive. So if dinner wasn't on the table, he wouldn't be a bit surprised and it wouldn't be an issue. And I suppose it's just giving you that freedom to do what you need to do when you need to do it, knowing that you're not going to run away, you're going to be there. Things will improve. As I'm from the West, and there's a saying in the West, this too will pass, and things always do pass eventually. So I think for me, the way that my husband has empowered me is just being there. So having the dinner ready, if I can't do it, because I never do it, the truth be told. And it's the small things, I think. And it's just, I guess really, in one sentence, it's just sharing the load. Just sharing the load.
Yeah, that whole concept is suppose feeds into that whole idea of being, you know, a 50-50 partner. You know, this idea that there are, you know, the mental load of the household being carried by the woman, regardless of whether it's a dual career household or not. So, and that's something I suppose I'm also very fortunate to have a very supportive partner at home. And that idea of that 50-50, there's no job in the house that is, you know, his or mine. You know, we take it on equally. And I suppose that kind of role modelling as well. Also, I think, you know, and it's funny because a lot of what we would talk about at home, you know, and particularly over there's been a lot of discussion recently about things like, you know, the awareness or developing men can develop an awareness of, you know, what it's like to be a woman, you know, and one of the things we talk about is, you know, getting ready for a night out. And I don't mean hair and makeup, I mean, you know, that kind of safety preparations that, you know, women and girls would have done all the time, and yet, you know, not all men, but a lot of men wouldn't even consider, you know, having to have keys in their hand or all these conversations. So that kind of awareness of the differences between, or we'd say of the female experiences of the world. I think that's also important.
I'll support all of those comments, and I would say specifically in the workplace to do two things: to be entirely gender neutral as to the individual. So just, you know, the person is in front of you is the person is in front of you, and you just take them as they are. Obviously, their personality and all that is something you have to factor into your day-to-day dealings. But the fact that they're male or female or gay or straight or, you know, different colour to you or whatever, just be completely indifferent to that, and that's part of that. So be indifferent as to the characteristics of an individual, but always to have an eye to the inequalities that still pervade in some of our interpersonal engagements. So always be conscious of the fact that you need to have more than one woman in the room, more than 0 women in the room, but certainly more than 1 woman in the room. Be conscious of the fact that women don't tend to speak up as much and might have to be invited to speak, to comment on something. Their thoughts are just as valuable. It's very useful to have their diversity in the conversation, but they may have to be asked. So to be neutral as the individual, but have a little bit of a gendered thought in your head about the fact that there might need to be a little bit of extra effort on some things to bring people into the discussion, and to make sure, because our organisations can only thrive on diversity if we're getting the best possible and the widest range of views into the space, into the discussions, and it's critically important, therefore, that everybody gets a chance to say what those views are. I'm very conscious of it, actually, because we live in such a hierarchical organisation still. So, you know, the automatic kind of, we'll ask me first, and then you kind of, and so it's really important that we try and break through that hierarchy and break through the gender sort of space and all the other dimensions to make sure we have a properly inclusive workplace.
Right. Well, look, I asked that question while also saying my own experience with the men in my life, either in my family or around, has been very positive, and I think that's the vast majority of women's experiences, but we're not where we need to be it in representation in the workplace and politics and other areas. So to get to that point, I suppose it's just about working together and making sure that everybody everybody plays their part in supporting each other. But I want to thank all of you for your contributions. Thank Alice and Gertrude as well for their presentation. But I'm going to open up to the floor now because we want to give everybody an opportunity to ask questions, to make a point, to make a suggestion, whatever it is you'd like. But the floor is yours.
Yeah.
Put a stick now.
You might have to shout.
Oonagh, you mentioned about there being that maybe might have been deemed not suitable for people. And I think the more people, the further up people go in their careers in the department, there's a perception that there's more and more roles that maybe might require them to work extra hours or weekends, and it's off-putting. And I've talked to a lot of women in the department who don't want to go for promotion because they feel like if they go up the next step, it'll interfere with their work-life balance. And I know you mentioned trying to put a focus on looking at the individual and not looking at their circumstances. But I wondered what more we could do as a department or even the political system to improve work-life balance and not have that expectation that there are some roles that you have to commit to 24/7 and you have to be available at the weekend. And how can we try and I know there's a pressure on the political system to have availability of civil servants there present, but how can we kind of improve roles to say, well, actually, you shouldn't be expected to devote your whole life and you're entitled to your work-life balance?
And I should clarify, I'm not particularly blaming any particular politician present. But anyway, it's very challenging, Tara. I wonder, does the way in which we've changed working in the pandemic give us an opportunity that possibly didn't exist prior to this? Because I'll be honest with you, I've seen this as quite a significant barrier the whole of my career. I've not seen any way of moving past it until there's a sudden transformation in either our political world or our media world and all that, and I don't see that coming, frankly. In fact, if anything, it's getting worse in the other direction. So I think, though, that I'm heartened by the fact, for example, that statistically, women apparently are much more likely to be in the workplace now than they were before the pandemic started. That suggests to me that the changes in the way we're working have helped many women, perhaps not women in the Department of Justice, but many women to be able to combine their work and their life in ways that are more adaptable to them. And I think if we can take those examples and use them, that could be a worthwhile way of thinking about it. The other thing as well is that I think we need to work through some aspects of, if you like, the working day. And we've hopefully in our heads managed to break free from the idea that a working day is from 9:15 to 5:30 or 5:15 on a Friday, as I know well. Save for your Haddington Road hours, which of course you're doing. And so the question is, are you getting the job done? Are you getting the job done at a time that suits you? Does it matter that you're doing that job between 7:30 and 10:30 in the evening because you've had to spend the afternoon, I don't know, being a mummy taxi or something like that? So are we able to shape our minds in ways that help work around this? And I see more colleagues, frankly, doing this. I see them able to manage. That's actually some of them fail, to be honest. Or maybe they're better at adapting and better at saying, this is my priority here. This afternoon I'm daddy taxi, and tonight I'll sit down and I'll send those emails and I'll do that stuff. So I think it just needs to be that. The other thing that has struck me a little bit, I think I might get a little criticised for saying this, is I'm struck sometimes by the fact that some of my male colleagues, rightly so, don't have any problem saying, I'm sorry, I can't do that at that particular time because I am dropping the kids to the GAA or whatever it is. And I never hear a female colleague say that. I would never hear a female colleague say that. So I think maybe we need to be a bit more honest about the fact that, yes, we do have kids running around our feet. We do and this is from a live example, a live Zoom, that dancing lampshade in my background is in fact my 8-year-old deciding to make fun of his mother. So, that sort of thing. Look, we've all had a huge insight into other people's lives in the last 2 years, inadvertently in a way. And what we can do maybe is try and take some of the best examples of that and take some of the best ways that men have coped with that and start to adopt those into some of our behaviours in the workplace and allow us to be responsive to that as well.
I say maybe just from the political perspective as well, I completely agree with Oonagh. I'm sorry it's taken a pandemic, but the way in which I now work is completely different to how I worked even 2 years ago. I was able to attend an event at 7:30 yesterday evening, finish it at 9 and walk into my kitchen and have my bite to eat and everything else, and before that put Michael to bed, while at the same time doing my work during the day. And I think we need to not apologise again for the fact that we have other things going on. Once the work is done, that's the most important thing. And maybe we need to say it more within the department or across the political sphere or whatever it is. But I certainly think the use of Zooms, technology, all of this, we have to take advantage of it. I thought the 1 month or 1 day a month off Oonagh was enough, but obviously maybe not. Sorry.
Thanks very much. I'm Hilka Becker. I'm with the International Protection Appeals Tribunal. Sort of one thing that I've been thinking about in recent years, particularly sort of since last year, is the idea of sponsorship as opposed to canvassing. So, canvassing is not allowed in competition, but is there a space for sponsorship? And that's not just in the Department of Justice, but across government, again, to identify disadvantages that people have, whether it be a gender disadvantage or whether it be a disability or having a migrant background or whatever it might be, to assess the need to kind of give a leg up to certain people. To kind of, I have this image in my head, and I think a lot of people will have seen that image of these 3 people standing on boxes. You have like a barrier, and 3 people of different sizes are standing beside each other, and the smallest one can't see anything, and then they all get a box, and the biggest one can still see. The middle one can now also see. The smaller one still can't see, and then you find a situation where the smallest one gets the biggest box, and the bigger one gets no box. But I was speaking at something this morning, and I was saying there as well, but you don't also know about that bigger person. That bigger person might have a panic attack they might have a mental health issue, and they might be able to have their head above that wall, but they still mightn't be able to see because they're in the middle of dealing with a mental health crisis. So is there a way of, sponsorship is sort of how I have termed it, is there a way for that, or a place for that?
I don't know if Maeve wants to answer, even just in terms of the research within the department and the equality strategy and how that applies to the department now.
Either Maeve.
Or maybe Oonagh, sorry.
Yeah, well,
no, sorry, we're probably venturing outside into the remit
maybe
of Alice
and Alice want to answer that either.
Well, just to say on sponsorship, I think that I certainly personally have benefited from having great bosses who gave me big challenges to do, including the current boss, of course, and every big challenge. Could you stop with the challenges there, Oonagh? So I think that there are certainly, but I've had to learn, and I'm still not brilliant at it, that there are people with sort of hidden issues or, and that's why I say that the last couple of years, it's been a huge learning for me because, to be honest, I came into the pandemic with look, you bring yourself into the office, your working self, and whatever goes on at home is going on at home. Don't be bothering me with it. I'm not able to do that anymore. And so I think that's been a huge learning for me in terms of my learning curve about making sure that I'm more aware of what's going on in the background of people's lives and when people might need like, to be honest, most of the time, all I can do is give them the encouraging word. You actually did really well at that meeting. The one thing you said was excellent. It was exactly to the point. It's exactly what was needed. You shut up when you needed to shut up. Good job. And I hope it's true to say that actually was sometimes the most encouraging thing I could do.
Oh yeah, I can remember getting texts from Oonagh Buckley in the middle of us all going, "You're playing a blinder."
So, and like, to be honest, we're all adults. Like, we all have to, be in the workplace. But, I can't help you with your childcare, and I can't help you with your errant husband or your, errant wife or whatever. But I can, or I can't even help you with mine. But, I can do that. And so that's the sort of thing that I try and think about in terms of that sponsorship. It's about kind of making sure that people know when they're doing a good job. And if they're not doing a good job, maybe they're told very gently that maybe that wasn't great that time, but you can do better, Yes.
But you would, say, there's Oonagh, she actually has a lot to say on this one.
Yeah.
And,
I can
that's
see you
sort of more
reacting
where,
and you have something to say. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think it might be very obvious too, yeah, but I think it kind of reminds us as well of the absolute importance of knowing your team, and actually taking the time to get to know your team. It's not just about their outputs. Yes, that's hugely important, but we're all human at the end of the day. And I think if you know your team and you just invest in that time to get to know people, you nearly then instinctively know when things aren't right, and it's easy then just have a quick word,
And also I think for particularly, well, not speaking for all women, but it's getting that validation, that validation from senior people. It's like for a lot of people I've talked to who've done Trojan work over the last 2 years, some of the answers I keep getting is, well, I'm just doing my job. I'm like, well, no, actually you've done above and beyond what would be expected of just a very narrow role. And I think acknowledging that, and maybe it's an Irish thing, we're just not great at giving compliments or taking compliments. And this isn't a compliment, this is an affirmation of the good work that's been done. And I think from an organisation, just being quite proactive in that will in itself generate certainly a more inclusive and a more positive and probably a kinder working environment.
Good. We have another question here.
Yeah, I know you can. Like we have one, but if we were going to have a second, it's too expensive. So one of us would have to give up, certainly work part-time or take a career break. Is there any way to even that out if you're going for a promotion and then, Aaron beside me hasn't taken 5 years off work? Like it's kind of a punishment for women to raise their children in a way where the opportunity mightn't be there because they don't have the experience. Does that make sense?
I'll just come in on that. Obviously, from a political point of view, we need to make sure that childcare is more affordable and that more people can access it. So we've obviously made strides in terms of the earlier years and the access to ACCE and all of the other schemes, but it's still too expensive. And obviously it means that you do have a situation still where people are deciding that one or the other will stop work, which is really unfortunately impacting more women than men. While it's still impacting some men, it's generally more women. So there's a lot of work ongoing at the moment, but we're not quite there. But I think that will be a huge help just outside of the department or the agencies or wherever it is that you're working, and acknowledge fully that we need to make more progress on it.
Well, I'll take this one. I suppose to be honest with you, you can see it from the gender pay gap figures that Alison Gertchen did. This is the big issue, essentially. It isn't that people are men or women, because the gender pay gap really, it's about family and about caring responsibilities. And I would say it's not just children. I think as we all face into a situation where our parents live maybe a decade longer than would have been the case even 20 years ago, we're all going to face caring responsibilities, even if, like myself, I don't have children, but I have an older father. And I think that in terms of trying to manage that challenge, the other thing that we're facing very starkly, and I hope you don't mind, I'm going to come all over financial just for a brief moment, but it is critically important. that women earn money now during their lives, many of them because they're in dual income households, they need to pay the mortgage, and they also need to earn for their pension. They need to earn this for when they're old. And yet we need also parents to raise children. We need, that vibrancy in our lives. So it's one of the major, I think the major underlying challenges of our age as to how we support that influx of women into the workplace in ways that kind of counterbalances, if you like, societal norms around who cares for children, who cares for parents. And it's extremely challenging because we have adopted various models up to now. You can see that in the civil service, which I have to say is probably one of the most family-friendly working environments, certainly in large organisations that exists, and yet we still have this issue. So we need to do more. I wish I could tell you I had the solution. Hopefully the Minister and colleagues have the solution. But certainly it's unless we solve it, women will be poorer during their lifetimes because they will suffer from the gender pay gap and the lack of promotion opportunities and so forth, and they will be poorer when they get old, and that's not good enough.
Their own creche.
Yeah, you could say that, but I used to be responsible for the civil service creche programme. Now, there you go. This is God's honest truth. And I have 4 sisters, and all of whom have children, and they used to absolutely split their sides laughing. That was the one sister without children who had responsibility for the creches. But many parents don't want to bring their children all the way into work. So there you go. That's the big issue there. So we used to provide the creches, and some of them were undersubscribed because they were in the city centre. People didn't want to bring their kids in. So yes, but yes, we need to provide more creche availability. We need to reduce the costs. We need to make it more available. And now we're going to need to make lots of them available for Ukrainians and their lovely children who are arriving in large numbers.
I'll leave the last word maybe to Oonagh, because I'm just conscious of the time, and we had said we'd wrap up by 1 o'clock, but Oonagh.
Thanks very much, and thanks to you, Minister, for facilitating this today. I think it's been really wonderful to get your perspective on it, and thanks to the colleagues who gave up their anonymity to do this today. I really appreciate it, and it's been really interesting. Just on that final point, I think one of the things always to me about International Women's Day is how we make the world a bit more equal and our workplaces a bit more equal, and it is about not stigmatising people of whatever gender for taking the time out. So we do have to make it easier for men to take the time out. Then, it won't be just the women that have taken the time out. It'll be whoever made that choice to do so, and that it isn't stigmatised. And I think your own partner is playing his part in that as well, Minister, at the moment. So, for me as well, the other point about Helga's reference to the boxes and the step-ups that you give people is really important, and just being conscious of people's own situations. But the final word I'd say here as well is in relation to what men can do, and I know there's lots of dads here in the audience and probably tuned in as well, and like the most important thing you can do is give your daughters the confidence to do whatever it is they want to do in life. And from the time they are tiny tots, to give them that empowerment. I see Gertrude, who I know does this on a daily basis with Mandy, nodding away, but it is absolutely the most empowering thing you can do for the women in your life. So with that, I'll leave it to you to wrap up, Minister. Thanks.
Thanks, Oonagh. Well, look, on that positive note, I just want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. Thank everyone for joining us online. Thank our panel of speakers and our presentation, the presentation from Alison Gertrude as well. I am absolutely confident the people in this department, on an individual basis, the way you live your lives, the work that you do, but also how you contribute within the justice space, has made a difference and is making a difference in progressing equality and women's rights right across the board. And all I would say is keep it up, and I look forward to working with each and every one of you throughout the year and hopefully beyond that as well. So again, happy International Women's Day, and enjoy the rest of your day, guys. Thanks.
Well done. Remind me where I'm talking. I grew up in Clonakilty. Oh yeah.
The world he left behind.